So let me introduce our amazing panel. We have a breadth of expertise that's really amazing. So I'd like to introduce to you Flaminia Macchia, who is the Executive Director for Rare Diseases International, Gwen Mayers, who's a health consultant, patient advocate, patient story coach from the United States. I have Deborah Chen, who's the Executive Director of the Heart Foundation of Jamaica and a board member of the Inter-American Heart Foundation. Christoph Thalheim, who's a patient advocate and the retired Director of External Affairs at the European Multiple Sclerosis Platform. So we're truly a global connection here, but people whose collected wisdom is extraordinary. And they're going to each share with us some examples of how they or their organization has achieved real political impact. And we've asked them to be honest about the highs and lows. What was the special source that helped them achieve it, but also what were the challenges they found and how did they manage to deal with them? So let me start, as I gave the introduction, let me start with Flaminia. Tell us about a time when you really achieved change.
Thank you, Tamzin. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. So I think that we can still share usefully the experience of achieving the adoption of the UN resolution on addressing the challenges of persons living with a rare disease and their families. Actually, rare diseases were not visible, were not recognized at the UN system. So obviously, the adoption of the UN resolution is in no way the end. It's actually pretty much of the beginning. And it was a way for the community to enter the UN system. Do I elaborate?
Yes,
more?
Please tell us a little bit more. I mean, maybe you could tell us some of the high and the low points. At some point, somebody said, let's do something at UN level. Now that's incredibly daunting. There's hundreds of countries. It's a complex system. When you went from saying aspirationally, oh, let's do something at UN level to actually make it happen, can you tell us a little bit about how you managed to organize your team, how much lobbying? Tell us a little bit about that process, because as you say, it's both a huge success and only the beginning of a process.
Yes, absolutely. Sorry, I interrupted.
I was going to say the work isn't just to get there, it's also afterwards then to take it and go ahead with it. So give us some inspiration about how you got there.
Yes, so as the topic today is political impact, well, we have to be very aware. We are obviously, I hope, all aware that political impact is really a journey. It's a marathon with some intensification of activities and very often a final exhausting sprint. But this journey is made of legitimacy, of credibility, and of hard work. So the way in which we achieved this political change is that we developed in parallel two processes. So obviously for many, many years, we were highlighting the need for a UN resolution on rare diseases, broadly speaking. The first step that we had to do was to make rare diseases relevant within the UN system, because for a very long time, the UN was telling us, well, diseases, that's not the UN, that's the WHO. You have to go to Geneva and deal with it with the WHO. We wanted, as a community, to have a holistic approach to rare diseases. This is why, in the end of the day, this UN resolution is not a UN resolution on rare diseases, but rather a UN resolution on addressing the challenges of persons living with a rare disease and their families. And the way in which we became relevant within the UN system is by making the key challenges of going through life with a rare disease relevant and linked to different sustainable development goals.
I'm on a Zoom here now, so I might have to jump off very quickly.
Sorry?
Yes, please go ahead, Flaminia.
So we made the links between different sustainable development goals and key aspects of a life with a rare disease. So this is to achieve political relevance, not political impact, but political relevance. Once we were relevant within the UN system, then we needed to make the political impact. And that's where the two parallel processes started. So one process was really focused to the community, namely RDI's members at large, so at national level, at regional level. And in parallel, there was the campaign directly towards the permanent missions in New York. So the work with the community was to launch and develop a campaign with a toolbox, toolbox to be used by our members. So that is available, publicly available on the website. We developed a visual identity for the campaign. We developed a logo, an infographic, social media posts, and also template letters for our members to use them at country level, because what we need to respect is the interaction between the national level, the regional level, and the global level, and they have to be mutually reinforcing. And the ownership over the overall campaign needs to be felt at all of these levels, because as RDI, we could only do the global level. So what we do is that we create opportunities, and then these opportunities have to be used at country level. So this is the community. And then towards the UN permanent mission, the member states' permanent missions to the UN, that was a lot of meetings, a lot of explanation, and having create what is called the sponsors. So you have a group of countries that actually become your advocates within the UN system, because we from the outside, we don't have direct contact within the UN system. So I guess I've said enough now.
I think that was really great. I mean, I took several points out of that I thought were really useful. I think the early one was don't take no for an answer. When they said, this WHO goes somewhere else, you don't take no for an answer, become relevant to your target, adopt their framing and narrative. So you needed to adapt what you were asking, etc. And then secondly, bottom up, top down, make sure that, you've got this continuum to make it happen. So I think this is some really good messages. Gwen, let me bring you in. We've heard an example from Flaminia. Tell us a time or example where you felt you had political impact, and then tell us what were the secret ingredients that made it work.
Sure. Well, also, thank you for having me on here. And I am so delighted to kind of blend together my expertise working in Washington in health policy, but also my experience as a patient with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. I'm going to kind of go to the other end of the spectrum, and that has to do with an activity that I was involved in actually in the early 90s that had a huge political impact, but is still being implemented and researched today. And that has to do with the lack of gender representation and the representation of minorities in clinical trials. So in the National Institutes of Health, as many of you may know, the main funding source for much of our clinical research in the United States, actually did not have until in policy, I think it was around 1994, I was working in the federal government in Health and Human Services at the time, did not have a requirement that if you applied for funds to the federal government, you had to report your data, you had to study and report by gender and by race, ethnicity. It's almost hard to imagine with the diversity of the United States that that was the case. But as a Women Heart Champion, which hopefully many of you got to hear Selena Gore earlier in one of the breakout sessions, part of our role, and I was working as a patient advocate then, in addition to my full-time job, was to meet with members of Congress to pass federal legislation. The reason I bring this example forward is oftentimes I think we think as advocates that we're here primarily to raise awareness of a specific disease. in this case, what we as women and as spokesperson were there to do was to really raise awareness of a systematic limitation in the access of good clinical data. So this wasn't just any one patient. Now, we had talking points that we took in. We also blanketed the national legislature, partnered with very influential organizations, employers, American Heart Association, groups of professional societies, American College of Cardiology, American College of Pediatrics, Society for Women's Health Research, looking at what was the totality of the lack of gender-specific research in on health for all of us. But, you know, it's interesting because it seems like it should be a slam dunk, right? Like that, it should be no-brainer. But it wasn't. It was challenging. And the number one hurdle and the challenge is it always looked like it just bothered women. And this was a learning lesson that I think has followed Women Heart and all of us that work in the area of women's heart health, is that women's health does not just affect women. It affects their families, their ability to stay employed, their income earning, and certainly what we know about male health and how that clinicians can be trained. So anyway, this legislation was passed. And so now the National Institutes of Health does require gender reporting and race reporting. But even at that, I'll just close by saying this has to be continuously monitored. One of the things about public policy is a persistence that just getting to one point is just one point. You have to remain diligent, understand your political environment, understand the drivers, understand who the decision makers are. And even here we are, 20 years later, I would do the math, but 20 years later, just this summer, Congress held a very important hearing in Washington, D.C. on how well we are doing with that. And there is still work to be done. And so this is just an example where not only was I participated in it, but from a professional perspective, it continues to be an effort by many, many key patient advocacy groups in Washington.
Thank you, Gwen. If I could summarize some of the takeaways that I took from what you said, look for pressure points in the system. Funding is key. People apply for funding all the time. So that's the point where you can make a change. Find allies to help get the message out there. Explain the implications for everyone. That's a way of getting out of your niche box that people keep trying to put you back in. Have a clear journey with specific milestones. Know how the next step helps you get further down the pathway. So thank you. I think those were really great messages for our audience. Deborah, let me bring you in. Mm-hmm. Can you give us an example of a time when you or your organization had real political impact?
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to use the example of tobacco control in Jamaica. And the Heart Foundation of Jamaica is a secretariat for the Jamaica Coalition for Tobacco Control, which I was one of the founding members. So those who know about tobacco control know that the WHO treaty was adopted in about 2003, 2004, and Jamaica actually signed and ratified shortly thereafter. Well, would you believe in 2022, we still have not got our legislation in place, although we are close to it at the moment. But going back in time, when we realized that we were not going to be getting anywhere with the legislation soon because of strong tobacco industry interference from British American Tobacco, with consultation with the then Minister of Health, who is very supportive, as is the current one, of tobacco control, we came to realize that we could, through the Public Health Act, enact some aspects of the regulation without waiting on the full legislation. That was smoke-free environments and graphic health warnings on the packages. So while you have a goal going to, maybe there's a halfway place that you can have an impact without waiting on the full impact, which, as I said, hasn't come to fruition yet. Anyhow, so we realized that this was an avenue to explore, and collectively with our group, our coalition is made up of the Medical Association, the nurses, the psychiatrists, all the leading health groups in Jamaica. And the Ministry of Health were supportive. So we then had to start lobbying to have this regulation passed under the Public Health Act. And you can only begin to imagine what the tobacco company did at the time. They did things like the regulation went to a joint select committee of parliament at which I and others presented at. They went and they gave politicians who were making the decision about this regulation big donations to their constituency fund, and we found out about it, and then we were all over the media exposing it. So it was just a constant battle the entire time. Eventually we did get smoke-free environments and graphic health warnings in 2014. And as I said, we still haven't gotten the legislation yet. And that is before another joint select committee as we speak, and the end is in sight. But I don't know how we're going to fare in terms of the industry trying to water it down. So one of the main things, though, in terms of success, you need to have strong support from credible organizations or people such as we had with our health organizations. You also have to try and do a mapping of the politicians and see where you can get some inroads. So for example, when we had presented to Parliament, when the tobacco company were presenting to Parliament, one of the parliamentarians who was on our side, the tobacco representative would get up and make a statement, which we knew to be completely nonsense. So, but of course, the politicians aren't steeped in it the way we are. So I had him on WhatsApp, and I would say, no, you can't allow them to say this. You need to say this. And then we would, and then by the time they shut up, he would get up and say, oh, that's not so. Because, we would have just sent him all the statistics on his phone. So you have to have that kind of lobbying, and you need somebody who can speak up for you to be champion. Also, you need to have some other groups, like in our case, the churches, the unions, supporting you. So it's an uphill battle. You also have to be very credible, and you need to base everything on evidence and not emotion. So as passionate as I am about these things, you still cannot go with that. You have to say, X% this, X% that, and some research was done, and so, and you have to show where the tobacco company did this, and you examine their financial report, and you can quote, and you just have to have all your facts about you, because at the end of the day, they're a very powerful opponent, not just in Jamaica, but globally, and they have everything at their disposal to come at you with, fancy professional arguments and brochures, and they can pay off scientists and so on, So you just have to be very credible in what you're doing and just stick to the facts.
Thank you, Deborah. And so great to hear about how you managed to outmaneuver a very well-paid lobbying organization. So a couple of points from you, be creative in looking for the levers of change. If you were unable to get the main piece of legislation through, look to see where you could slot elements in so you could put the building blocks in place. Find trusted champions who can be your voice in the places where your opponents are making the arguments, and then make sure that you're set up to provide the evidence, the information, and fast responses to allow them to put that out there, and make sure you've got strong support from credible allies. Thank you. Some great lessons there. Christoph, let me come to you. An example of a moment where you feel like you've really achieved political impact.
Right. With great pleasure. In the pre-talks, Gwen mentioned something which made my ears growing, if this is an English expression. It is the word of patient registries, which is a brilliant methodology to get proofs for what you are going to say as a patient advocate. For example, in the field of efficacy of certain drugs, which are constantly challenged by people, for example, in the field of health technology assessment, where the decision is taken, will we reimburse publicly this drug or will we not? So patient registries have been a valuable source, but if I look some 10, 12 years back, and then the situation in my field of expertise, MS, was that every country where there was a registry was keeping the data for themselves. and used the data in the best case scenario for some publications, scientific type, or for improving the individual care of individual people by certain neurologists, but not for political aspects and for advocacy. So in order to make these data more useful and valuable, there was a clear need to identify or invent something which those custodians of the registries could accept as an added value to what they had done for years or even decades. That our proposal then was to agree on a minimal data set which would be integrated or identified first and then integrated into the existing registries. With this minimal data set, we would be able to prove certain things, certain theories about drugs or about developments, efficacy and others, safety, for example, but only if all the registries would agree that this minimal data set would be indeed the same way, the same definition, the same way of asking the data to the patients, etc. By talking about that again and again and again on various levels, including the European Medicines Agency, we became, or we made the step from becoming relevant to impactful, because in the European Medicines Agency and their Patient and Consumer Working Party, we were able to raise the awareness on this initiative of the European Multiple Sclerosis Platform so strongly that they automatically put us as one of the pilot diseases in what they call the Patient Registries Initiative. And that made then the step to becoming impactful, because if what is in the US, the FDA, in Europe is the European Medicines Agency, if the EMA says we need patient data from registry groups rather than individual registries, and they need to follow certain criteria, and that was exactly our demand, then that is something where everybody has to follow or will follow, because the companies who are producing the drugs, they want to sell and get market approval. So therefore, the approval by the EMA is vital. So to cut a long story short, today we have something which is called the European MS Data Alliance, in which many registries in Europe are participating. They have this common data set, and the data are used not only for the areas I just mentioned, they are also starting to be used for health technology assessment and for questions on reimbursement without the previous detour, which were the CROs, the companies which are collecting the data and then selling it to the pharma companies. Today, we are in the process of using the data directly for the needs of the pharma companies, so that finances for the registries are looking better now as they did 12 years ago.
Thank you, Christoph. Again, a really interesting example of change. And a couple of points that I took out of it is, decide what's useful to you rather than what other people are doing. Once you've got clear what it is that you need and what's useful to you, repeat your message. and keep repeating it. Make sure it's heard in many different places, which means that once you've made visible the need and also your readiness to act, that's when you could be adopted as the pilot disease, because it was clear that it was a workable, feasible option for the politicians to take. So thank you for that. Let me ask all of you now to reflect on the role of politician allies or even politician advocates, because sometimes it can be a double-edged sword. You can have a political champion, but then they also can make other decisions. But let's sort of start by sort of saying, how do you identify that politician champion and what convinces them? Is it statistics? Do you need to go in there and put all the data? And this afternoon, we've heard lots of data about the number of deaths, the number of the disease burden, etc. Is that what convinces a politician? Is it emotion? Is it the emotional impact? Is it bringing stories from their constituency? What can you tell us about your experience of converting a politician into an advocate for you? And this is important because, a politician, to get to that post, they've created a lot of political and social capital. So they're watching out for their own reputation, and they're always thinking about, the next election and their hierarchy within their own political party. So there's a lot of things that they have to manage. How do you get them to invest some of their political and social capital that they've created for themselves in the issue that you're interested in? Now, who amongst my panel wants to pick up on that?
I can start if you
Yes,
want.
please go ahead.
So I think it's very important to demonstrate to politicians that if they want to achieve what they have committed to achieve, then they have to respond to your needs and they have to address your challenges. So if I transfer this and transpose this to the global level, which is slightly more complicated because we are not talking about the constituency that is going to directly vote for them. But nevertheless, if the UN member states want to implement universal health coverage, which they have taken the commitment to within the UN political declaration on universal health coverage, then universal health coverage would not be able unless and until the needs of persons living with a rare disease are not addressed. So they already took a commitment, and that could work also in a more national and directly political campaign at country level. You have said that you want to achieve this and that. Well, in that case, if you want to be serious about that commitment, then you have to listen to us and you have to deliver on your commitments.
Thank you. I think that's very clear, is to help for them to meet what they've said they want to do. They have to deliver what you want. Thank you. Gwen, go ahead.
Build upon that. I think that this is a long game. This is a long-term game. Political influence and advocacy on a political front is not a quick fix. So just like any other relationship, you really want to know everything you can about the politician, regulator, decision maker, what part of the country they're from, we hear what's important to them. All of that should be a public record. So you want to create a dossier or a profile on the key decision maker to understand what is important to them. I always think that political advocacy for patients is really a two-way street. So part of my job is not just simply to ask for what I need or patients like me, but it's also to provide them information, data, stories, what is going to be helpful for them to go back to their constituents and show that they have made progress in a certain area. So I think of it more as a two-way street. And you're going to have a long-term relationship with them. This isn't really a quick fix.
Thank you, Gwen. And I'm struck by the connection between what you said. And there was apparently a really great fundraising session for the audience yesterday. And one of the advices was if you need to raise funds, ask for advice. In other words, go and create the relationships, because it's the relationships that will eventually lead to financial support. And Gwen, you said, it isn't a one-off, magically turning someone into a political champion. It's developing that relationship, understanding their context, their interests, their community, their constituency, and seeing how you can address that. Deborah, do you have, you talked about having a very close relationship with some champions in the Parliament, to the extent that they trusted you, that if you sent them information, they could deliver it, knowing that you've done your work and it's good, strong, solid evidence. How did you, and there are some politicians who are in the pocket of the tobacco company because they got large donation. How did you work out, when you meet a politician, who's going to be a good ally and who's someone that will not be someone you can trust?
Yeah, it's not one size fits all. It's a very individual thing. So I don't know, in some of the bigger countries, which many of you belong to, maybe you don't have access to the politicians the way maybe we do in Jamaica. Not everybody does, but we can have more direct access. We go and we actually make meetings with these people, and we go and we see the minister of this and the minister of that. You can tell in a personal meeting whether they're being honest or not. You can pick that up with body language. So by the time the meeting is finished, I have them figured out. So if they're going to be in the play of the tobacco industry, such as in our parliament now being debated, then I don't waste too much time on them, because there's only a certain amount, how far you can go. Personal experience on part of the politician is very important. If they can relate to it and they have somebody in their family, then you find that out and then you build on that relationship. You try and give them some political mileage out of it as well, if that's what they wish. So, they can be taken pictures with you. You can invite them to be a guest speaker at something the Heart Foundation of Jamaica or the Coalition for Tobacco is holding. So you give them what they need out of it as well, International support is also important, because we have called on our colleagues sometimes overnight to send letters and press releases to our media to give us support in terms of, the various regulations that we want to pass. And that means a lot. In some political circles, everybody has a representative of the WHO in their country. And if their representative comes out and says this, if not directly, indirectly, or if the World Heart Federation sends something to the newspaper or the Inter-America Heart Foundation, then that really helps as well. But I really think it comes down to individual, and you have to know who is for example, is the Prime Minister supportive or not, and who is lining up behind him? And some of them don't want to waste their political mileage on something that they feel is not going to get them where they want to go politically. So it is constant. It is a moving target, and you just have to have your finger on the pulse and just be aware. And then the other thing is, just as you get it sorted, they move them. So just as you've got it all figured, either the political party loses power or the Prime Minister moves them to another portfolio, and then you're back to square one. So as was mentioned earlier by Gwen, it's a long haul. And if you're not persistent, and if you just keep going one foot in front of the other, otherwise you'll give up in no time, and policy change is not easy.
Thank you very much, Deborah, and I love that idea. We're in it for the long haul. We're persistent, and we will outlive some of these ministers in their political life, which is often short. They will get demoted, they get promoted, they move. Absolutely. So sometimes, if you hit a wall of opposition, you just have to keep going, and it will move because something will change. Thank you for that, and a reminder to the audience: use the Q&A function to ask questions to this amazing panel that we've got of the accumulated wisdom of advocacy and political impact across the world. Christoph, let me ask you, in your experience of talking to politicians, what was how you saw the media? Sometimes we create petitions, we do marches, we do political stunts in front of the Parliament. How useful is that? Does that influence them, or is it, a well-argued, well-evidenced short document that makes the difference? Can you give us a sense of which of the tools is the one that you feel most useful for a politician?
I'm not sure that I can answer that question by giving you one word or one sentence. What I experienced twice is that the starting point for two of our best champions was their personal experience. And we started with a bit of luck, that a patient of MS felt discriminated in their home country, in the UK, complained in the UK about this discrimination, was not heard, went to the European level, was heard in the petition committee of the European Parliament, and then the boss of the petition committee told us about a member of the parliament who has MS. And of course, with approval by that lady, he asked her first, can I tell the patient advocacy group that you have this disease? So this was the introduction to a wonderful relationship of the patient advocacy group on European level and a champion who fight like hell for us to make a resolution happen against the discrimination of people with MS in Europe.
Thank you. Let's now move beyond the idea of just, individual political champions, but start talking about how you build a coalition, an alliance, a network of organizations with whom you would work. When you take a particular issue, how do you work out who are the real decision makers? And I think this is important. Deborah, you talked about, if you have a political opponent, you just have to wait them out and they'll move on. But how do you, if you've invested in a network of relationships like Christoph, you have this great political champion, how do you make sure that you have enough of a network that if that person changes or moves, etc., that you haven't lost all of your network? Do you have advice or examples you can share with our audience? Who'd like to respond on that?
Well, I can give another example there, a quick one. In the European Parliament, again, there are working parties or working groups related to a specific disease area, or like neurology or heart diseases, and they meet regularly and try to get a number of MEPs as permanent members. So if you push forward with such a group, then one less or more doesn't make a major difference.
Thank you. Gwen, go ahead.
Well, one that comes to my mind really has to do in the recent years, and that has to do with women's reproductive rights. Most of you have heard of Obamacare, not a term I like to use, but people have heard of it. The Patient Protection Affordable Care Act passed in 2010. And one of the main provisions in that law was to provide approved contraception, so methods that have been approved by the FDA at no cost to women. So it's quite a landmark activity. However, the legislation then deferred to the regulators at the department, the administrators, to define what was considered approved contraception. And as you can imagine, there's all forms of contraception out there. I think we here in the United States identify 19 different methods, pills, patches, shots. So to actually attack that, in building a coalition to make sure that it was broadly defined, a huge coalition led by the National Women's Law Center. So part of going about doing that is what I call a landscape analysis. Any issue that you have, and this is just a really broad one that came to my mind, you want to identify who is in your landscape and then have some questions to evaluate them by. How politically astute are they? Who are their funders? How long have they been in existence? How credible are they perceived? Who are their, how do they get membership dues? Are they in the media? Do they have a reach in social media? And one of the things the National Women's Law Center did, which was pretty sophisticated, was they categorized a broad swath of interested parties to get into this coalition. Some they knew were kind of mom and pop at a local level, some all the way up to the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and everything in between. And so that's just an idea for a very large issue, again, a landscape analysis, so you can differentiate who your partners are going to be and what it is that you need them to do. But I have to admit, at the end of the day, the most important question I always ask is, how much political clout do they have? Can they deliver politically? Who are their friends? Who are their political action committees? how much they speak about things politically. And of course, women's reproductive health is quite a political issue.
Thank you, Gwen. Deborah, do you want to add in on this?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that we do here is we also engage the opposition at all times. So it's not just a matter of who is currently in power. You have to engage the other side, who is a spokesperson on health, or not just health. We deal with agriculture, education, some other ministries. So the other thing to remember is that there are technocrats who don't, well, I shouldn't say they don't change when politicians change, because that's not true sometimes. But for the most part, the technocrats are there all the time. So the people who work in the Ministry of Health and so on, whichever ministry, they are there. So you continue to work with them and keep a good relationship, continue to keep in touch with the opposition and the other people in the party, not the ruling party, not just health. Because if there's a cabinet shift, then somebody you were talking to before could have moved over to health. So that's the most you can do, keep the issue alive. We send press packages down to our parliament, on a regular basis, depending whatever the issue is, whether hard copy, soft copy. So you kind of keep in that space so that if the government or the minister, a particular minister change, you still have some leverage there.
Thank you. Flaminia, what would you share?
Yes, so one of the key successes of having this UN resolution positioned firmly within the UN system and in this specific holistic ways is that now we can deepen some challenges. So for instance, when it comes to gender equality, we can work more with UN Women on the basis of discrimination against women, because it is very clear from the evidence that we have. So this links with generating evidence, in addition to testimonies from people who have experienced discrimination, is that women are particularly excluded and discriminated against when living with the rare disease, either as a person with the rare disease themselves, or as the mother, as the primary caregiver. And very often women do become the primary caregiver in a family where there is a child, or also an elderly person or an adult living with a rare disease. When it comes to human rights, we have now developed a very strong relationship with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, based on discrimination based on health. So obviously it is a very hot topic for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. When it comes to access to education, we have had very recently an event with UNESCO talking about inclusion of children living with the rare disease within educational systems. So from something very holistic, you can then generate specific new and also innovative partnership with other bodies and create new alliances.
Great. Thank you, Flaminia. We've got a question from the audience that I think is worth exploring. It was submitted by Tanya Hall. She's the CEO of Hearts for Hearts. And she's asking, we've spoken very much so far about how we seek to influence politicians, but she's asking, how can we get collaboration between governments, clinicians and patient advocates together to improve health outcomes? So I wonder if you can explore that, where the politicians are our partners rather than necessarily the targets for our advocacy. Who on the panel might like to speak to that?
Well, I'll jump in and just kind of get
please.
It started. I think it really relies upon discussions that we've been having yesterday and today, relationship building, and particularly if the focus is on political influence, then there are going to be common interest in all of these partners, all of these entities, and identifying. So it may be that the government's common interest is to have a different tax base. It may be that they want to employ more individuals. Maybe they're going to put a large medical lab that's going to employ so many people in a community. Clinicians may see this as funding sources for research. Maybe there's a disease or a rare disease or a new technique that is going to really be prominent for them. So I think at the end of the day, the relationship building should be long-term, should have common goals and identify those, enormous amount of transparency, and to really, among yourselves or among these various entities, have a mission, a very clear and agreed upon mission for what this entity is doing and why they are doing it together, and how each of those individuals and each of those types of individuals have a potential to benefit. Not everybody is going to agree. Not everybody is going to have the same benefit. But I think being transparent and identifying the common areas and working from there is one way to go about it.
Thank you. That's a great suggestion. Who else on the panel would like to share how you can work together with governments, healthcare professionals, and patient advocates?
I can give an example where clinicians and patient advocates were working closely together. First, targeting governmental decisions they didn't like. And later on, the government was convinced that what the clinicians and patient advocates suggested makes sense for themselves as well. The example is from the country of Poland, and we're going back now something like 15 years. And in Poland at that time, people with MS were really in a difficult situation, because certain drugs which were available in other countries were not available there. And the reason given by the health ministry was, well, we don't have the funds. Well, we started to argue that as long as you have funds for tanks and rockets, you should have also funds for the well-being of your citizens, which is a bit short-eyed, but well, it created some attention. At the end, the clinicians were in the same boat as the patient advocates, because they said, we are facing our patients every day, or each time they are coming and see us with bad news. Sorry, we cannot help you, although there are possibilities to help you, but only in other countries. Our government doesn't do it. So with a joint action of both clinicians and patient advocates and later journalists, it was possible to raise awareness on the fact that Poland was at the very end in the comparison of all European countries in terms of access to these MS drugs. And once that became public in the TV and in the media, other media, then the government felt they have to do something. And they found ways to increase the funds. And from a beginning of maybe, I think I remember well, it was 742 people who had access to these drugs at the beginning, out of around 50,000 patients with MS being identified in Poland. At the end of the initiative, there were more than 15,000 of them eligible for the drugs. And the government and the politicians, and that is the end of the story, the positive end, was praised for their action to make people feeling better with the help of those drugs and also rehabilitation.
Thank you. That really is quite a big impact, to go from sort of less than 1,000 to more than 15,000 people having access to to treatment.
Yeah.
Flaminia, I'm going to ask you to answer another question that we've had submitted from a colleague in Nepal, because I think that's an interesting challenge. She's asking, there are countries around the world, and obviously you face that with Rare Disease International, where there is very little or very under-resourced health system, and there's very little health insurance, and which means that patients can't get the treatment they need because of the high prices of medicine or surgery. How do patient organizations be part of a movement that can push for universal health insurance or universal health coverage? Now, I know that you mentioned earlier that the UN resolution is just the first step, and that's then used at national level to try and push for improved access. But so I wonder if you could tell a little bit more to Shugat how patient organizations could be part of that bigger conversation. You're on mute.
Yes, so that is really the difficult one, right? And obviously, I'm speaking from a global alliance, and therefore the work of RDI is targeting the global environment and do everything that we possibly can together with with our members to create the most supportive global environment for rare diseases and for persons living with a rare disease. What we can do, again, is to create these global opportunities. So really the UN resolution is a tool. And one thing was to get the adoption of that document that can also only remain a document. But what is going to be the next step is the implementation of that document. And as you said, and as we keep on saying, the implementation will have to come from the national level. So we create the opportunity, and then it's up to the people on the ground to take advantage of that opportunity. What we can do also, and we are doing it, and we have launched recently an implementation toolkit to follow up the adoption of the UN resolution. So we can provide another toolkit and really empower and support the empowerment of these national patient organizations with a series of tools, really to share the knowledge we have of doing advocacy, of doing representation of our community directly to national and then European and then regional and then global policymakers and share it. It's a peer-to-peer kind of capacity building. But then again, what can we say? It's really up to the national level and to the kind of relationship that patient organizations will be able to create with their national policymakers to advance universal health coverage. And the UN resolution currently has very, very strong language around universal health coverage. The objective that 193 countries have decided upon is around the corner. It's 2030. So progress needs to be achieved. Countries have committed to that. So we develop a toolkit. We have developed, as well as an organization, what we call a strategic engagement program. So really to engage more and more the national level to support their own national advocacy priorities.
Thank you. Deborah, let me bring you in.
Yeah, I just want to say that to take it even further back from what was said from Nepal, and bear in mind that our countries are at different stages of evolution and development in healthcare. We do not have a concept of patient advocate organizations. You will have, the Heart Foundation of Jamaica and the health professional groups will advocate, but we're not at the stage yet where this whole issue of advocates with a particular disease profile come together to advocate for them. So we're at all different stages of development. And when it comes to volunteerism, going back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, when you have a population and how many of them are below the poverty line and just above, trying to make ends meet, trying to get basic things, you're not going to have that level of volunteerism that you're going to have in countries who are more developed. So like lower middle income countries like mine and lower income countries, there's so many social issues out there that you're not going to have this framework of which we have spoken so widely about today. It is not our reality, to be honest.
Thank you. We've got just 3 minutes left in our time. And what I'd like to ask each of you is exactly what we're asking the audience, which is the just one thing. So what is the one piece of advice or final insight you would like to give our audience? Remember that in this session, we're thinking about how we can achieve real impact, real change. So what's your one guiding message that you would like to give our participants? And Gwen, I'm going to start with you. What's your key takeaway, the message that they can put in their pocket and pull out in times of emergency to help them through it?
I think the key word that comes to mind is persistence. This is the long-term interaction, building relationships. Look for interim victories and signs of progress, but it requires a long-term commitment and little by little achievable.
That's great. Thank you. Christoph, what's the one thing people should take away? You're mute.
Here we are. So I just read recently a saying which I think fits well as an answer to your question. The saying is, everybody said that it is impossible until one came who did not know this and just did it. So in other words, be innovative and then persistent.
Thank you, Christoph. Deborah.
I agree with everything Gwen said. You're in it for the long haul. Nowadays, we watch something, a 30-second clip on YouTube, and we're bored and we move on to something else. That type of personality doesn't work in policy change. You have to know it's for the long haul. And I agree, small steps, and try and find something that you can do practically before you come to the final legislation. So I agree with what Gwen said entirely.
Thank you. Flaminia, what's your one insight that you'd like the audience to remember?
Maybe it would be around consistency. Like, I think that if we need to beat the drums in different places. We need to sing the same song from different angles. And I completely agree with what Deborah was saying, that every country has its own specificities and comes from a very different perspective. But if we work all together consistently, we develop like 3 to 5 key messages that are also around strengthening national healthcare systems, indeed, then the famous together we know more and together we can more, and we have to sing the same song. So for me, consistency is key.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to draw this panel to a close. And what an extraordinary range of expertise we had. And you were really generous with your insights and your experience. So on behalf of the audience, I would like to say a very warm thank you to Gwen, to Christoph, to Deborah, and to Flaminia. And I'm sure our audience feels inspired and empowered in order to achieve more political impact. So thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.